But there's a documentary set to come out on PBS North Carolina, actually less than 3 weeks from today,
Sheesh.
August 8th.
Scary.
At 10 p.m. About the documentary called When Giants Walked Here. It's a Jim Crockett era pro wrestling documentary. But this documentary, Cliff, I'll start with you since you're the director of this. This is more than just a wrestling documentary. It's a documentary of history, not just in Raleigh, but of North Carolina. Like, this is North Carolina history just as much as it is a wrestling documentary.
Absolutely. We're documenting the history of wrestling in North Carolina, specifically at Dorton Arena. So for Raleigh folks, we'll know Dorton Arena as this masterpiece of architecture on the fairgrounds here in Raleigh. But for decades and decades, it was one of the most important places for professional wrestling in the South, in the country, and specifically in North Carolina.
So if you've ever been to a game at PNC Arena to watch the Carolina Hurricanes or NC State basketball or a concert or something along those lines there, or been to the State Fairgrounds, you have seen Dorton Arena. It kind of sticks out. But Chris, from what you've learned from this documentary, like, where does this era of the documentary cover? I mean, obviously the Jim Crockett era of professional wrestling, for people that don't know, was probably its heyday was in the mid-'80s.
Yeah.
But it goes well beyond that and even before that.
A lot of the wrestling that we cover is specifically in the 80s for Jim Crockett, but we kind of show you kind of where the beginning was, and we give you a little bit of history of the building and why the building is important and why wrestling was important to the original idea and the view of what that building could be for this community. Wrestling was literally the perfect thing that they could put inside of that building. And then we talk about, when WCW kind of swooped in and bought the operation and how things started to fizzle out and wrestling stopped in 1993 at Dorton Arena. And then it eventually came back with some independent promotions in 2016. So, but the actual, the meat of it we are looking at is the heyday, that golden age that a lot of people call it in the 80s.
So a lot of people think of the Greensboro Coliseum, Cliff, in terms of Southern professional wrestling. The Greensboro Coliseum is like what Madison Square Garden was for professional wrestling and just events up north in the Northeast. But Greensboro Coliseum, obviously us as college basketball fans, we know ACC tournament and the history there, but Greensboro Coliseum was such a big deal. But here in Raleigh, where we're located and sitting right now, Dorton was the place. And it wasn't just like, here's 500, 600, maybe 1,000 people. It was thousands of people would pack that place on a night.
Every single week. That's the thing that I think.
Yeah, on a weekly basis.
That's the thing that surprised me so much when we started looking into it is we think about, even major sports shows now, you don't think about every single Tuesday, 5,000 plus people selling it out in one place. That doesn't happen in wrestling, much less other entertainment mediums very often anymore. So this was a weekly thing for 3 decades. Every Tuesday, you'd have thousands of people in one place for wrestling, and it was Dorton.
So what happened? What happened? Like, how can things go from like consistently doing so well, and then all of a sudden it's just gone?
The short version is it went national. As television media started to get bigger, started to go national. Crockett Promotions ended up selling to Ted Turner, Media, TBS, TNT, that media empire, and they took the show national and they wanted to tour nationally. They wanted to be more like what we now know as the WWE, going all over the country, all over the world, doing these big shows. And that was great, and it brought in a new heyday in wrestling, but it also meant that these local communities lost their wrestling, the thing that they were so dedicated to, the fact that you could go every single week, have your seat, where that was your place that nobody got in but you. That started to go away, and Dorton was a building that wasn't particularly television friendly. It didn't have that Madison Square Garden history to it, or that allure, and so they started moving away and going bigger places, and wrestling went dark there for over 20 years.
Which is crazy to think about. And Chris, I know you as a former professional wrestler yourself, we saw other promotions try and copy what the WWE was doing, whether it was Jim Crockett Promotions or even like down in Texas, WCCW, and with the guys of like the Von Erichs, they tried to do somewhat of the same thing, but they end up eventually same type deal. Like late 80s, early 90s, all these independent promotions and these regional establishments all just kind of just dwindled and faded away.
This isn't necessarily something specifically we put in a doc, but I think if you kind of look at the history of television and how it's produced and distributed, you also see how wrestling changes along with it.
Yeah.
And in the 80s, when you have, cable television had been around, but it was still more of of a regional type of thing, and as it becomes a little bit more national, folks want to start having more national tours. And it wasn't just good enough to come to Dorton. Let's go to the Spectrum in Philadelphia. Let's go to the Garden in Boston. Let's try to see what we could do in Chicago, so we can get those markets and also have bigger TV ratings. And so that's part of what, what Cliff was just saying is what kind of just killed the regional flair. And with Dorton being the place it was, I mean, for when it was built, it was innovative.
Yeah.
But it became old kind of fast. There's a lot of things like it still doesn't have air conditioning.
No, it doesn't.
So it's not a very comfortable place. It's probably the best atmosphere for wrestling, right? But it's not a very comfortable place to have. And when you have bigger, plusher arenas that you can put more people in who can be a lot more comfortable and get more bang for your buck as a promotion. So that's part of what let it fizz away. I was going back as we were doing this thing together, going back and looking at my history of going to wrestling events. My first wrestling event was in 1993 at the LJVM Coliseum Annex in Winston-Salem. And I was looking that like some of the last professional wrestling events in Dorton were like literally the days after those events I was going to in Winston-Salem.
Really? Okay.
And so it was interesting for me because the cards were very similar. And it was a lot of the same wrestlers, and it was like I was a part of the history, even though I never got a chance to witness it in Dorton. So I thought that was a cool connection to my personal life.
That's Chris Lee alongside with Cliff Bumgardner. They are Cliff Bumgardner, director and co-producer, along with Chris Lee, co-producer of the wrestling documentary When Giants Walked Here, about wrestling in the state of North Carolina, but specifically at Dorton Arena, which, by the way, Dorton Arena, if you've ever been to the state fair, that's where all the giant pumpkins and all that kind of stuff, like that's where all those are inside Dorton Arena. Cliff, I want to ask you this, because wrestling was so prominent on a weekly basis in Raleigh, or as Chris mentioned, in the Triad, how vital was wrestling and these promotions to just the fabric of the community, just locally, in terms of economic impact, cultural impact? Like, that is such a big thing. For example, one of the things I love here in the state of North Carolina is minor league baseball and how it's woven into the fabric of our community. Pro wrestling was no different.
Absolutely. I mean, you just hit on like my passion totally with this.
I think go.
Because when people think about wrestling, they think of this big crazy show, right?
Yeah.
We don't think enough about the fact that these were local businesses. You had in the 80s, Crockett Promotions during certain years in the 80s were grossing $30 million or more.
Wait, I'm sorry, say that again?
In the 80s.
Yeah, in the 80s.
Like per year?
Per year.
That's insane.
And they had like 5 or 6 full-time employees out of an old convenience store in Charlotte. So you have this local business that's doing insane money.
Yeah.
And that's just the money that, the company reports. That's not talking about the people who parked cars, the people who set up the ring, the people who sold programs and popcorn, not just in Dorton, but there were times where they were running multiple buildings every single night, every night of the week. So the economic impact of that, I mean, I don't even know that you can really quantify it, if the data even exists to really say what a massive impact that was. But then even money aside, just culturally, when you have a place like Dorton where you go every single week, you go with your family, you go with your grandma, you go with your grandfather, your father, like that was a bonding thing for people. There are stories about North Carolina governors sitting on the front row at these wrestling shows. And the thing about Dorton, I was thinking about this, Chris, when you were saying about, bigger arenas, there's no VIP boxes. There's no separation. There's nothing special like that. Everybody's in the same place. Everybody's together. That creates a community that you don't get other places.
And then to add on to that, as far as this local area and the flavor here, WRAL has always been, the top station, right? Locally owned and all that. Jim Crockett Promotions did their TV tapings in the same studio I do sports at Monday through Friday every night. And so that's where the Ric Flair and Ricky Steamboat feud began, in those studios. And so
right there off Western Boulevard,
right
literally
there,
right down the road from
So
Dorton.
when you have the TV tapings and they'd set up the big match at Dorton, and people, the 100 or so people who could fit in that studio would also go to Dorton to see the big match that you couldn't see on television. That was huge. It was like people knew that, these guys are going to be hanging out, behind the TV station at this time, going to this particular bar, and we can see them the next week when they come back to Dorton, and we can come back to the TV station to see them again the next day. Like it was that circle of things. So like Raleigh was a huge part of the success, and it was a huge part of this community when wrestling was here.
And you talk about like the how TV was so regional in terms of what you could watch. Like you would watch these people on television like at the same time every single week, and it's like, Mom, Dad, we got to go to Dorton. Whatever it is, like we got to go to Dorton to see like this payoff of this thing we've been watching on TV, Cliff. And people in droves would show up.
Well, think about like everybody loves the circus, right?
Yeah.
But who would go to the circus every week if it was in town?
Mm-hmm.
Wrestling had to appeal to people on a personal level. That's why the issues in wrestling are so personal. That's where you get the classic promos. That's where you get these larger-than-life characters, all this kind of stuff, because there aren't a lot of other industries that were promoting live every single week in your town. And just the fervor that it takes to sustain that for 30 years creates its own culture and its own community that we heard from so much in making the film. We went into it going like, okay, we're going to look back, and I'm sure people will have fond memories. The response that we had was people were telling us stories as if it happened yesterday. I mean, this is vibrant culture that exists to this day. And now there is some wrestling back in Dorton, at least 1 or 2 shows a year. And people it's maybe not what it was, but people can experience that again, which is the other incredible part of the story to me.
And a big part of the story that we tell is also like how it impacted wrestlers who ended up becoming international names. Shane Helms, who's from this area, known as the Hurricane in WWE, currently a producer for WWE. We've interviewed him together, Dennis.
We have.
And he's in the documentary. He used to go to Dorton, and that is the arena that he always thought about when he was thinking about becoming a professional wrestler. And he finally was able to have his opportunity to wrestle there in 2016. We showed that. And then also C.W. Anderson, internationally traveled pro wrestler, was an ECW original. He grew up in the area as well. He's a part of the documentary. You hear his voice all over. And he was one of those guys, too, that was inspired by Dorton Arena. So it's not just about what happened, but also the seeds that Dorton planted for the pro wrestling industry.
I mean, I think, Hurricane Shane Helms was wrestling on a national television basis basically 4 or 5 years after Dorton Arena ran its last show. Yeah. So it wasn't really that far removed. When you really think about it, it really wasn't that far removed, that trickle-down effect. Dennis Cox sitting in for Adam Gold today, being joined by Cliff Bumgardner and Chris Lee. Cliff, the director and co-producer, along with Chris Lee, the co-producer of the documentary When Giants Walked Here, is going to make its debut on PBS here in the state of North Carolina at 10 p.m. Thursday, August the 8th. So after the Carolina Panthers played their first preseason game, flip on over to PBS at 10 p.m. that night, and we'll have you'll be able to watch the documentary. But it's also, if people want to, here in Raleigh, want to go to another historical Raleigh establishment, Cliff, they can actually see it 2 days beforehand at the Rialto.
Absolutely. August 6th, 7 p.m. We're having a free screening at the Rialto. Tickets are free. It actually comes with free popcorn, which is a nice bonus. But all you have to do is sign up online, and you can get all that information from PBS NC.
But you got to act fast, because out of like 400 and something seats, over 300 have already been claimed.
Yeah, I claimed 2.
And my mom claimed 2, and she's coming up from Florida to watch this.
Oh, really? Okay.
So like, I just found that out this morning. So you got to get your tickets. Again, they are free. PBSNC.org. Get them now, because we may not have seats after next week.
So real quick, if you can't make it to Rialto and people still want to see it on a larger scale, maybe you can't watch it that Thursday night, where can people watch the documentary? Before we get into more about it, just to make sure people know, where can other people watch after that 10 p.m. showing that Thursday night? Where can people watch it?
Immediately after that 10 p.m. showing on August 8th, it will be on the free PBS app.
Okay,
so you can
free
go
to watch.
Download it right now,
Beautiful.
Free to watch, throw it on your TV, whatever you want to do.
Whenever you want to see it. It'll have some reruns on television as well, but the main thing we want to push is that PBS app. Go ahead and download it so it's already there on your phone, and you can watch it back anytime.
And there's also going to be some other events where it's going to be shown as well here in the state in some different places?
Yes, WrestleCade in Winston-Salem. It's always a big-time wrestling event for the last, 10 years.
End of November, correct?
End of November is Thanksgiving weekend. It's going to be an amazing... TNA is having a pay-per-view there on Black Friday night. And then you have the actual WrestleCade day, and then we're going to have a showing there as well. We'll have more details to come as far as times and all of that. But just like at the Rialto, we're after the film, we're going to have a Q&A with some of the folks that are inside the film. We're going to do the same thing at WrestleCade, and we're hoping that we'll have more of those around the state of North Carolina, so just stay tuned.
All right, real quick, Cliff.
Yes.
Where did the idea of this project come from, by the way?
I grew up in Raleigh, and growing up, especially in the mid-'90s in North Carolina in the South, I like to say that like being a wrestling fan wasn't a conscious choice. It's just
what you were.
It was just what you were. My dad's a huge wrestling fan, and I grew up going to the fairgrounds and seeing Dorton. And so I grew up knowing that there had been wrestling there, but there wasn't any there in my lifetime. And when I got older, when independent wrestling brought some shows back to Dorton, I just started thinking about like, why was there a gap? What happened? There seems like there has to be a story there. And I started researching it and just found that if you want to understand a really particular and beautiful time period in wrestling history and in North Carolina history, Dorton is a lens to allow you to do both. And I contacted Chris. We thought it was going to be 10 minutes.
We're going to put it on YouTube.
And here we are 3 years later with a feature film under our belt. So it's grown.
It's about an hour long.
Yes.
Roughly about an hour long.
About an hour long.
What's something that you learned from fans? I'll ask both of you guys this. What's something you guys talking to fans and people who used to go to Dorton Arena? Was there anger? Like when they finally closed doors and like shows really weren't what they used to be? Like was there anger? Was there resentment? Like what happened?
There's a fan by the name of John Hitchcock who has a book called Front Row Section D.
All right.
Him and his three friends, especially in Greensboro, were known as some of the first loud, rowdy fans to wear colorful shirts and to bring signs to wrestling events in the 80s.
All right.
So they actually helped to inspire a lot of the guys that you'd see at the ECW arena, which ended up being a part of the wrestling fan culture. He's in the documentary as well, and he had one of the best lines I think that's out there. It was like a religion. And so when you take away our holy place that we can come have our religious practices and watching pro wrestling,
that's my sanctuary.
We are going to be angry. And so there was a lot of anger. There was a lot of resentment. And there's a lot of people from that time period who never got over it, who probably stopped watching wrestling since then. WWF, WWE was always the place in New York that wasn't for us. Mm-hmm. We had the place for us down in Charlotte. And that place didn't come back around, and they sold, and they're not here anymore. So we lost our place, so we lost wrestling. And that's how a lot of people took it. And for a lot of folks, it's different. Maybe you turn into a WWF fan for the first time, and now you've been following them. But for a lot of fans, they took it very harshly when it left.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
Well, imagine, think of it too, if anyone's lived in a town that has lost their sports team. They had an NFL team and it went away. That's what it was like. It was our team.
Like the St. Louis Rams.
Exactly. Yep. It was here, it was our team, and even though, we're good guys and bad guys and people we liked more than others, it was still ours. And you take our wrestling away, there were a lot of people that never got back into wrestling because they lost what was theirs.
I can only imagine what that would feel like. I can only imagine. And again, this is not just wrestling history. This is North Carolina history because you talk about, again, a small business running out of Charlotte, North Carolina, pulling in $25-30 million a year.
Unbelievable.
And then all of a sudden it's just gone.
Yeah. And
there's nothing really left to show for it. It just disappears.
Yeah.
That to me is probably the biggest thing that I'm curious to see about and learn about from this documentary is just, how does that happen? Yeah. How does something like that just completely go away? Again, the documentary, When Giants Walked Here, I can't wait for it. It releases on PBS 10 p.m. here in the state of North Carolina on Thursday, August 8th. And then as soon as the documentary's done, it's about an hour long. It's on the PBS app. You can watch it anytime. It's also going to be at the Rialto Theater on August 6th. Get your tickets where again, Chris?
PBSNC.org. They have, it's free, but also we just want to put it out there. If you're going to plan on it now, because again, there's just over 400 tickets available. Well, it was, and now there's 300 that have been taken, over 300 that have been taken. So we don't have the exact count right now. So it's probably at 100 or less than 100 that are currently available for fans to have. So it's going to be a packed house. It's going to be a great time.
I'm stoked for this. This is going to be a great thing.
And we need to mention C.W. Anderson will be a part of the Q&A afterwards. Yes. So you can meet and greet us, myself and Cliff. Also C.W. Anderson, who is a professional wrestler who grew up in this area, ECW, original, world traveled, and all of that. He'll be there as a part of the discussion board. And David Crabtree
Yes.
We'll be the moderator.
Oh,
so
nice.
Former WRL alumni, big wig at WRL, and now he is the head guy. What is this title? It's PBS.
Other bigwig?
Yeah, he's God at PBS North Carolina. So he's going to be there as well to be the moderator for the Q&A.
Come learn about North Carolina history. Like, seriously, it's really history. And I know for so many people like myself, I'm a big wrestling fan. Chris, you know this. Cliff, you know this probably now as well. But I'm a big wrestling fan. But I also, having been in North Carolina for the better part of the last dozen years, learning more and more about this state and what has taken place here in the history in this state really is fascinating. And I know there's a lot of people that live in North Carolina that didn't grow up here. But this is also, again, now that you live here, learn about it. And this is another big piece of it. Final question for you both. What's the most exciting thing that you learned while doing this documentary? What's the thing that you maybe, I don't know, didn't expect that you learned from doing this documentary?
I think it's just that deep personal connection. I think it's just when you talk to people and to see people get emotional about a building that they grew up in, it really told us. Like I said, we thought it was going to be 10 minutes, and we did like 2 interviews, and I looked at Chris and went, nah, man, there's more to this here. And I think it was just that emotion that I didn't anticipate. And it's the thing that you hit this so well. It is North Carolina history. You don't have to be a wrestling fan. If you've never watched wrestling before in your life, you're going to get an emotional, human, personal story.
Love it.
And that is at the heart of this thing. And that is not necessarily what I expected, but felt very lucky to get to witness firsthand and to get to share through the movie.
Mine isn't necessarily in the film, but it's growing my friendship with Cliff, but then also seeing him be introduced to wrestling in a different way, not from a fan's perspective, but to be in the locker room and to be around these wrestlers and things like that, and being able to like break that fourth wall for him, and as a person and also as a director, that was kind of a cool experience for me, and just building my relationship with him. So there's going to be more to come from us.
You'll see, I'm sure, footage and pictures of some of the greats like Ric Flair, Dusty Rhodes. Like, they all wrestled right here in Raleigh. Some of the best to ever do it walked right through the doors of Dorton Arena. That's Cliff Bumgardner, Chris Lee. Thank you guys so much. Really do appreciate it. I cannot wait for the documentary to come out and to watch it. I'm super stoked for this.
Thanks,
it's a
man.
great thing. Thanks you guys for popping in studio. Again, that's Cliff Bumgardner and Chris Lee. Cliff, the director and co-producer. Chris, the co-producer of the documentary When Giants Walked Here, a PBS documentary set to air about Jim Crockett era professional wrestling, a documentary, again, that debuts on August the 8th. Thank you guys again so much.